Cloudborn stood as the last great city of the kingdom of Dra'vereth, proud citadel perched high against the sea winds, its towers bright with the banners of a nation now brought to its very knees. 13 days had passed since the first breach tore open in the earth, a vast jagged wound that bled fire and nightmares into this world, and from that chasm poured the Horde, a tide of horrors that swept across the northern lands with terrifying speed, razing village after village until nothing but smouldering ruin remained in its wake. For several days the people of Cloudborn watched the distant horizon darken with the drifting smoke, each new column a silent testament to another fallen town. Thousands of refugees staggered to the city's gates, exhausted and broken, begging for sanctuary, as the glow of the approaching horde slowly grew brighter each night, heralding the end of everything they had ever known. Within the high tower of the citadel, King Harald Gala convened his war council, gathering around him the finest minds and the bravest commanders Cloudborn still possessed. They argued late into the night, their voices echoing off the stone walls, worn thin by sleepless planning. For nearly a fortnight they had launched desperate assaults against the breach, attempting to stem the flow of monstrous infantry pouring into their lands. But every attempt had ended in a heavy loss and grim retreat. As the council bickered over their dwindling options, whether to stand and die, whether to strike once more at the breach, or whether to surrender and pray for mercy, Harald rose from his chair in silence. He stepped toward the great northern window, resting a hand upon its cold frame, and gazed out toward the unnatural glow drifting beyond the horizon. And in that sombre moment, the king understood what no one else wished to accept. Dra'vereth could no longer be saved. The kingdom would fall, along with its capital, in hours or days, and all that remained was to salvage what lives they still could. With a heavy heart, King Harald ordered the great retreat. Every soldier, every civilian, every wounded soul who still breathed was to march east along the seacoast road toward the safety of Fort Na-Gaile and the great bridge of Dervock. Beyond that bridge lay the Binding Isle, the final gateway to safety. Sanctuaries the Horde could not so easily reach, so long as the sea remained between them. To buy time for the retreat, a contingent of bronze sentinels remained behind, their ancient metal bodies humming with the power of their enchanted cores. Their tireless guardians had defended Cloudborn for centuries, and now they would make one more final stand. And so the long march began. King Harald led the column eastward, with his 3 sons at his side, Harald IV, Maltus, and young Fallon. The journey should have taken 3 days, but the reality was far slower. The wounded stumbled, and the elderly lagged behind, and fear weighed heavily on every footstep. When night finally settled over the coastline, the refugees made camp along the rocky shore. The bronze sentinels formed a silent ring around them, their faintly glowing cores pulsing like embers in the darkness. And for a brief moment, hope flickered amongst the camp. Perhaps they might have one uninterrupted night's rest. But peace lasted only as long as twilight. Not long after the last campfires had dimmed for the evening, shadows began to stir within the tree line to the north, and a small band of demonic scouts slipped out from between the trees. The sentinels reacted instantly, their bronze blades flashing in the moonlight as they met the enemy head-on. Yet their presence told King Harald everything that he needed to know. Scouts meant the Horde was looking for them, and they weren't far behind. And once discovered, the column would not survive the night if they remained still. Harald roused the refugees with a booming command, urging them to their feet and driving them forward into the darkness. The column pressed eastward with renowned urgency, fending off scattered attacks along the way. Though they suffered wounds and losses, the survivors pushed on, desperate to reach Fort Na-Gaile before the next sunset. When the battered company finally reached the gates of Fort Na-Gaile, they were met by a sea of tents and campfires stretching out across the plain. Thousands of refugees already gathered, anxiously waiting to cross the bridge of Dervock to safety. But with the Horde closing in, Harald knew there was no time left to spare. Unless the fort held against the coming assault, those waiting at the bridge would be slaughtered before they could flee. Harald ordered every able-bodied individual to take up arms, reinforcing the walls and preparing what defences they could. He and his sons stood atop the battlements, each assuming a role that mirrored their strengths of their character. Harald IV took command of the western wall with the calm confidence of a seasoned commander. Maltus, ever sharp-eyed, positioned himself atop the main tower, directing a volley of arrows with precision, and young Fallon, far too eager and desperate to prove himself, hurried from rampart to rampart, meeting the enemy wherever the fighting grew the fiercest. What followed was a siege so unrelenting that it would later seem less like a battle and more like a storm, a violent endless storm of claws and fire that crashed upon Fort Na-Gaile for 2 agonizing days and nights. The Horde struck first at dawn, with a crashing roar that shook the very ramparts themselves, their twisted silhouettes swarming across the plains like a living tide of shadow. Each assault came harder than the last, as if the enemy wished not only to breach the walls, but to grind the very fortress itself into dust. Maltus held his position atop the western tower, a slender stone pillar rising above the battlements, where he could see every corner of the battlefield. From that height he commanded the archers, loosing arrow after arrow with precision. Near midday, a towering demon swollen with flame lumbered toward Maltus's tower, dragging a massive iron chain, and with a thunderous swing it lashed the chain upward like a whip. The link struck the tower's base with an explosive force, cracking the stone in half. Maltus staggered as the ground lurched beneath him. The tower groaned, tilting, shedding stones and dust in a roaring cascade. With only a heartbeat to act, Maltus leapt from the crumbling ledge, catching hold of a tattered banner as the entire tower collapsed behind him. He swung wildly downward, slamming into the battlements before rolling into the courtyard. Breathless, but alive, the place where he had stood moments earlier was now nothing but rubble. Elsewhere, King Harold and his eldest son fought side by side along the inner wall, coordinating the ranks as the defenders struggled to repel the waves battering the fort. Their section of wall had held since the siege began, but the unending pressure of the enemy at last became too much. Dozens of demons' dead bodies had piled high against the outside of the wall, and without warning, the wall exploded. The explosion tore through the battlements in a storm of splintering stone. Harold and his eldest son were thrown backward as the walkway beneath them crumbled. For a moment, they were suspended in a cloud of dust and debris. Then both men plummeted into the courtyard below. They crashed into the earth amid shattered stone and twisted bodies. The wind knocked from their chests, yet even as they struggled to breathe, the enemy poured through the breach, shrieking with triumph. Young Fallon had saw the breach from across the courtyard, and without thinking the youngest son darted forward with the impulsive fury that defined him, throwing himself at the oncoming wave to buy his father and eldest brother time to rise. His blades flashed in dizzy arcs, cutting down foes twice his size with reckless determination, and for a moment he seemed unstoppable, a spark of wildfire channeling the storm, until a demon's club struck him square across the ribs, and Fallon collapsed, coughing up blood, barely conscious, but still clawing at the ground as if dragging himself back into the fight by sheer stubbornness. As sheer chaos consumed the courtyard, King Harold struggled to his feet, dragging his eldest son upright. Harold IV's brow was split open, blood pouring into his sight, yet his posture remained resolute. Together, father and son rallied the defenders around them, pushing back toward the breach with shouts drowned out by the roar of battle. The fighting blurred into a single desperate struggle, no longer for victory, but simply for more time. As the sun soon began to set, Fort Na-Gaile was little more than a battered, flaming carcass of stone. What had once been proud towers now lay in heaps across the courtyard. Half the walls had collapsed. Bodies, friend and foe alike, blanketed the ground. The Horde did not tire. They did not fear. They did not grieve for their fallen. They simply continued their relentless advance, knowing they outnumbered the living 100-fold. Fort Na-Gaile could no longer withstand even one more assault. But on the distant eastern edge of the plain, illuminated by a dim glow of dawn, he saw movement. The final line of refugees had started to cross the bridge of Dra'vereth. Harold ordered all remaining soldiers and his sons to fall back, to guide the last of the civilians across the bridge of Dra'vereth. The king was the last man to step foot onto the bridge as they slowly started to make their way across. But as he set foot on the bridge, a new wave from the Horde came again. King Harold turned to meet the Horde head on, along with the remainder of his bronze sentinels. The king was struck down, mortally wounded by an enemy's blade. Young Fallon cried out in despair as he tried to make his way back to rescue his father, held back by his eldest brother Harold. He knew what was coming. King Harold commanded the bronze sentinels to ignite their cores, sacrificing themselves to destroy the bridge before the Horde could reach those who he had just saved. The constructs obeyed without hesitation, as King Harold looked at his three sons, and with a final, solemn whisper, "For Cloudborn, for Dra'vereth, and for all who remain," the king stared into the sky as the sentinels released the full fury of their cores. A blinding eruption of light and thunder tore across the gorge, shattering stone, cleaving timber, and sending the advancing demons tumbling into the churning sea below. When the smoke finally cleared, only fragments of the great bridge remained, drifting like blackened bones upon the water. This ended the Battle of Fort Na-Gaile. A battle ultimately lost, but its people were saved. The kingdom of Dra'vereth had suffered a wound from which it would never fully heal. Yet, the courage of a king and his sons and the bronze sentinels ensured that hope endured. And though Fort Na-Gaile would soon be swallowed by flame and ruin too, the memory of that final stand would survive for generations, carried in the hearts of all those who crossed the sea that very day.